In the grand historical economy of global dominance, there's a rule as old as empires themselves. You see, you don't conquer the world by buying more than you sell. You conquer it by stacking silver, surpluses, and occasionally stealing things that don't belong to you. British Museum. Trade surpluses weren't just a nice metric in the imperial ledger. They were the engine of empire, the bankroll of expansion, and the justification for all of the helpful invasions empires doled out in the name of civilization, God, or spices. Almost every great power in history ran some version of this playbook. Sell more than you buy, invest the profits in ships, armies, and bribes, and repeat until your maps start requiring multiple folds. However, there is one exception to this rule: the United States. In fact, some are calling the United States a unicorn empire because they have one thing that defies every other empire that has ever existed. And that one thing could cause the USA to rise forever, potentially, or to cause them to fall. But let's start off with the old empires. If empire was a corporate business plan, the British Empire in the 19th century was Amazon on a Victorian bender, except instead of prime delivery, they offered railroads, taxes, and unsolicited governance. What fueled Britain's rise wasn't just naval power or poetic colonial smugness, it was a massive trade surplus, especially during the Industrial Revolution and its high imperial days. You see, Britain was the world's factory. I know, shocking. Between 1800 and 1870, British exports exploded. By 1870, Britain accounted for nearly 25% of global trade and produced over 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods. They exported cotton textiles, locomotives, steel rails, and all the things that looked great on a balance sheet. Meanwhile, their colonies shipped raw materials back in return: cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, and whatever their navies could coerce from reluctant trading partners. Even more importantly, Britain ran a chronic current account surplus and reinvested it abroad. By the early 20th century, British foreign investments were worth over 180% of GDP. That is not a typo, everyone. Britain was essentially lending to the world while exporting its legal systems, railways, and red-jacketed troops. And whenever they ran into a trade imbalance or a deficit, like when the Chinese were selling Britain enormous quantities of tea and silks while buying absolutely nothing in return, Britain did what any morally centered capitalist democracy would do: they pushed opium. Through the East India Company, Britain flooded China with Indian-grown opium in the 1830s and 1840s. When China had the audacity to protest this narco-economic trade model, Britain responded by launching the Opium Wars and forcing China to accept more drugs and unequal treaties. This wasn't just a war, it was an export policy with gunboats. Now, this lasted for quite a long time. But coincidentally, the empire began to decline right around the time those surpluses began drying up. You see, this started happening around World War I, but it also happened during the interwar period, World War II, the rise of American and German industrial competition, and the eventual collapse of the gold standard. All of these things contributed to Britain's decline. However, pretty much the second they stopped having trade surpluses with the world was the second the empire was done. Another example here I'd like to give is the Great Roman Empire, the one that everyone likes to romanticize, right? Rome didn't technically invent imperial surplus economics, but it perfected the art of monetizing plunder and slave labor into a trade policy. Rome's idea of economic diplomacy was simple: conquer first, account later. From Spain to Syria, Rome amassed territory not through trade negotiations, but through swords, sieges, and a relentless obsession with turning other people's gold into their senators' villas. The Roman economy was in many ways a giant redistribution machine. They redistributed wealth from everyone else to, well, themselves. After conquering a region, Rome extracted wealth in the form of taxes, tribute, slaves, and resources. When they took Egypt in 30 BCE, they essentially acquired the most fertile agricultural land in the Mediterranean. Egypt became the empire's grain battery, fueling Rome's ever-growing population and feeding the state's subsidized grain hole. When Emperor Trajan conquered modern-day Romania in 106 CE, the spoils of war were so immense that one historian estimated it amounted to over 330,000 kilograms of silver and 165 kilograms of gold. That's not conquest, that's a hostile corporate takeover, let's be honest. The use of slaves in agriculture, mining, and production kept labor costs at zero. This gave Roman elites a surplus to spend on more villas, more roads, and more wars. Trade did happen, but it was heavily tilted in Rome's favor, especially with its provinces. It wasn't an even exchange, it was a tribute disguised as commerce. But again, as the empire was growing, wealth flowed into Rome. But then two things happened. The plunder pipeline dried up, Rome really stopped expanding, and also they were importing vast quantities of things like spices and luxury goods from the Far East, and the Far East wasn't really giving much back or buying much back. So Rome started to go into a trade deficit, and this was with some of their largest trading partners in the world. In fact, there were writings of Roman senators at the time saying what a waste it was to import all of these luxury goods and not really have any long-term benefits from these goods. At the same time, Rome's military and bureaucracy kept growing, so the state began, well, printing money. It was replacing silver with cheap metals to pay for its expenses. Inflation followed, trade routes became less secure, tax revenue shrank, and Rome started importing more than it exported. Especially, well, as mentioned, luxury goods. And coincidentally, this all happened right near the decline of Rome. And lastly, there is the Dutch. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was a tiny, swampy republic that punched way above its weight. Their secret: net exports, good trade surpluses, and this was all done through the shipping industry. The Dutch Republic ran one of the earliest documented cases of capitalism as a geopolitical weapon, okay? The Dutch East India Company wasn't just a shipping company. It was a militarized trade machine with its own private army and navy. They cornered the global spice market, dominated trade routes in the Indian Ocean, and set up fortified outposts from Java to Japan. By the late 1600s, the Dutch controlled over half of Europe's shipping capacity, and Amsterdam had become the beating heart of global finance. Their shipyards, their banks, and their markets formed the infrastructure of global trade. The Dutch were so economically efficient, they made mercantilism look like a part-time hobby. Now again, they were running a bunch of trade surpluses with the rest of Europe. They imported cheap raw materials from the Baltic and exported high-margin finished goods like textiles, refined sugar, and weapons across the world. Their banks then financed other countries' wars, including Britain's. And when those nations couldn't pay, the Dutch ended up owning their debt and, by extension, their policy decisions. Pretty much their trade surplus was leveraged power around the world. So how did this end? Well, once Britain and France built better navies and begun undercutting Dutch exports, the trade surpluses faded. The Dutch economy, so reliant on trade surpluses and external trade and finance, they couldn't sustain themselves. So they started to go into trade deficits. By the end of the 18th century, the Dutch had become a financial appendage of Britain, absorbed into its rising empire. All in all, with the Dutch, there was no surplus, no ships, no say in anything, no empire. And so if you were to go back through all of history, you would find a similar pattern. Almost every empire, ever, has had trade surpluses with the rest of the world. Except for one. Except for one. The United States. So history has been pretty clear when it comes to empires. Step 1, get rich by exporting goods, conquering neighbors, or both. Step 2, build a navy. Step 3, rule the world. And step 4, try not to collapse under the weight of your own hubris. But then America showed up and said, cool story, but what if we just didn't do that stuff? So now let's go into 1945. America had just helped win World War II, and unlike literally everyone else, it hadn't been bombed into the Stone Age. Europe was smoldering, Japan was radioactive, the Soviet Union was freezing and traumatized, and America, well, America was fat with factories, gold, oil, and optimism. It controlled 50% of global industrial output, it had 80% of the world's gold. It was like waking up after a party and realizing you're the only one still dressed and holding a job. So the US did what any rational post-war superpower would do. It called a meeting, and here's what it said. Let's rebuild the world economy, but also, let's make me the leader, the main character. Thus began the Bretton Woods system, where the dollar became the center of the economic universe, pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and everyone else pegged their currencies to the dollar. It was a clean, sensible thing to do. It was grounded in real things, a financial system built on actual gold and trust. Well, mostly gold, actually. And for a few glorious decades, it worked. The US exported cars, steels, appliances, and freedom. And the occasional coup d'etat, actually. The United States was the factory floor of the world. It was the bank as well, and the DJ of the global economy. But then, the 1960s happened. In the span of 10 years, the US decided to fight a massively expensive war in Vietnam, It went to the moon, it invented Medicare and Medicaid, and held on to 800 overseas military bases, all while keeping taxes politically palatable and domestic consumption was cranked to 11. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan rose from the ashes and started exporting like their lives depended on it because they did. Suddenly, Americans were buying Volkswagens and Sony televisions, and the US began running trade deficits. For the first time ever, the empire was importing more than it exported, and the response from Washington was basically, don't worry about it. But other countries did worry about it, especially France. French President Charles de Gaulle took one look at America's spending habits and said, no. He started cashing in US dollars for gold, as was his right under the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that's when America snapped. In 1971, facing a potential run on US gold reserves, Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of dollars into gold forever. He did it on live television, by the way, like he was announcing a game show twist. And with that, the US dollar became kind of just a vibe instead of anything tangible. No more gold backing. Just the full faith and credit of the same country that brought you Watergate and microwaved nachos. This was not a currency anymore, guys. It was a branding exercise, and the craziest part, it worked. You'd think the world would have panicked. Instead, they shrugged and said, well, I guess we trust you. For now, I guess. And to make sure they really had the trust, the US pulled off the greatest backroom financial deal in history. In 1974, the US made a quiet deal with Saudi Arabia. All oil must be priced in US dollars. Just as simple as that. In exchange, they'd sell them weapons, look the other way on some of the human rights issues, and throw in a few military bases for fun. This birthed the petrodollar system. Suddenly, if you wanted to buy oil, they needed US dollars. And if you needed US dollars, you needed to sell stuff to the US. The whole world started exporting to America just to earn the very currency they were required to use to buy fuel. It was the economic version of a global subscription service where the US was the only payment processor. So, while most empires, if not all, throughout history earned global influence through exports and trade surpluses, America earned it through demand. It became the buyer of last resort for the entire planet. You made it, America bought it. You sold it, America gave you dollars. You had extra dollars, you bought US Treasury bonds. America got cheap goods and cheap debts, and the world got safe assets and a very large bill for US foreign policy. However, something had to give. In 1955, manufacturing was 28% of the US's GDP. In 2023, it was just 10.5%. Wall Street began exploding like a caffeinated vampire. The US didn't need to make things anymore. It made money because it made money. Hedge funds, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, private equity, NFTs for dogs, whatever you want, America was doing it. The US became the world's financial playground. Global investors flooded in to buy American stocks, bonds, real estate, and tech dreams. The trade deficit widened and nobody cared, because the capital account surplus was making up the difference. And that just means the money net flowing into the United States. So in plain English, America bought physical goods from the world, and the world reinvested its profits by buying America. Now again, this essentially makes the US the only empire in history that did it through running trillion-dollar deficits. However, things are starting to change. The federal debt is over $36 trillion. The net international investment position is $18 trillion. That means that America owes the world a record amount and owns comparatively very little in return. The trade deficit is $800 billion or so as of last year. But yet, the dollar still accounts for 58% of global foreign reserves and over 80% of international transactions. Why? Well, it's because there's no alternative. Europe is too fragmented, China's currency is too controlled, crypto's still trying to figure out if it's a money thing or a pyramid scheme. As long as the US keeps policing the world and dominating global finance and controlling the reserve currency, it can run deficits without necessarily paying the price. But some cracks are forming. China and Russia are now trading in yuan and rubles. BRICS countries are now discussing a new shared currency. Central banks are buying gold like it's 1970 all over again. The dollar share of global reserves is also declining. So the world isn't dumping the US dollar overnight, but it is changing. So can America keep this up? Well, for now, maybe, because the dollar is still the prettiest horse in the glue factory. But maybe one day the world may finally say, you know what, maybe we don't want to bankroll your debt, United States. We don't want to fund your military and sell you everything in exchange for monopoly money anymore. And when that day comes, this whole empire of deficits will look a lot less financial. And when that day comes, this whole empire of deficits will look a lot less like financial genius and a lot more like the longest running pyramid scheme in history. But until then, pass the credit card, everyone. The Empire has another round of F-35s to order. Make sure to check out my YouTube Creator Academy in the link down below if you want to learn how to grow your YouTube channel or make videos like this, and also click on my documentaries playlist to see, well, more videos just like this. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in my next video in just a few seconds.